All right. Today, our roundtable guest on the G list is Sam Hayes, where the G list is where everybody is a star. Sam Hayes is an award-winning author and journalist. A few years ago, maybe, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago now, I got a call from Sam Hayes. Who told me he was going to write a book about Henry Harris. And would I agree to be interviewed? And I said yes, because Henry was, as I said, the first black athlete at Auburn University, the first black athlete at a major white university in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. And I knew Henry well, hung out with him, watched him play basketball, and remember, I have a lot of memories about Henry. Sam's book came out in 2019, a year ago, and unfortunately with the COVID, again, this is another thing that's been affected by the COVID. But the name of the book is Remember Henry Harris, a lost icon of a revolution, a story of hope and self-sacrifice in America. And it tells the heroic and tragic story of Henry Harris. You know, today we talk about Black Lives Matter. And if in fact Henry was alive, or if in fact Black Lives Matter had been around when Henry was around, I'm sure that Henry would have been one of the poster children for Black Lives Matter for what he gave, not only to the university, but to this country. There is, in August Wilson's play Fences, there is a line where Troy Maxson, who is the lead actor, the main character, and Troy is bitter because he didn't get to play professional baseball. He played in the Negro Leagues, but of course it wasn't integrated, and so he never got to play in the major leagues. And his friend, in talking to his friend Bono tells him, he said, well, Troy, you just came along too early. And Troy responds, and this is probably one of my favorite lines from the play. Troy says, there never should have been a time called too early. And is how I sort of sum up Henry Harris. For 4 years, and this is straight from Sam's book, for 4 years, Henry Harris went one-on-one with racism, the old South colliding with the new South in the life of one brave young man out of Alabama's Black Belt. So let me bring on Sam Hayes, and we're going to talk about Henry Harris. Good morning, Sam.
Hey, Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I appreciate you being here with us. Everything good with you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. It's always an honor to be able to talk about Henry Harris. It's an honor to tell his story. He was a remarkable American.
Tell us what drew you to Henry's story, Sam.
Well, in 1980, I was working with the Atlanta Constitution, and I had the opportunity to spend 3 months interviewing the first black athletes in basketball and football at all the major schools in the South, including the SEC and the ACC at that time. And so in doing that, I came across Henry's story, of course, and I was aware of his story before, but I began to get it a little more in depth there. Actually, I was sports editor in Columbus, Georgia in 1974 when a story came over the wire that said that he had died apparently of a suicide. And that hit me really hard. It made a real impression on me. My reaction was this, meaning the integration of Southern College athletics, which I've been very a proponent of, in favor of, wasn't going so well. The behind the scenes, there was something missing that we weren't seeing. And I had seen, I did not go to Auburn, but when he would go through the SEC, I would see him play every year. He was the same age that I was. So We were both born in 1950. And so he was a freshman. I saw him. I didn't even know Auburn had integrated. It was, I couldn't believe it. I didn't, it was great to see him. And I remember, it was kind of like seeing a man play with boys. He was, of course, the only black person on the court. And so each year I would see him in Athens and where I went to school at the University of Georgia. I would see him. And so I felt a connection there. Tremendous respect, of course. And then when I learned he died. So as I worked on that story, I became more curious I learned more about his background and more curious about what had driven him to that point. What was his life really like? And at some point, a couple of years, 3 years after that, I decided was when I contacted you in 1984 and said I want to do this book. And there's been a lot of stops and starts and a lot of rejection slips from through my literary agent. So I eventually was successful in getting the book published last year, and I'm thankful for that opportunity to get his story out there because it needs to be out there. There's a lot we can learn from the life of Henry Harris.
One of the things that you do in the book is you place Henry not only as the pioneer athlete in the Deep South, but you place him in context of what was going on nationally in the country in terms of the civil rights movement. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, you can't understand Henry Harris unless you understand, like many of us, the time in which he lived. I mean, he grew up. He grew up in Bowling, Alabama, in Greene County. 84% black. It was the blackest county in Alabama. It's over in about 40 minutes southwest of Tuscaloosa. And extreme poverty. When he left there, it was like the fifth or sixth poorest county in America. And, his choice to go to Auburn was largely driven because of the need he saw and heard from the people he grew up with, that somebody needs to do this. You're Thom, you're the first person that told me this. That's what he always said. And you said that you got that curiosity too. You asked him, why did you come to Auburn? And he was 2 years ahead of you. And he said, well, I did it for the old folks. They told me that this was a good thing, that somebody had to do it. And there was no question that people had been waiting, African Americans had been waiting for years for this opportunity. The window was always shut. There were so many players in the South that never got the chance to play for their state university. And suddenly the window's open. Auburn and Alabama have decided to integrate. And so now's the opportunity. How can you walk away from that opportunity? Well, others did, but he didn't. He felt that this was a good thing, and he was going to go do it. And it wasn't, and that drive wasn't just there initially. It kept him there when things were hard, when things were very hard, and other people, common sense, might have said leave. Well, he wasn't going to leave. People wanted him to leave. It was now part of standing up. I mean, it was certainly not as dangerous as the freedom rides, but it was the latter days steps of the civil rights movement. I mean, if he leaves, then the enemy wins. Racism wins. And he was playing the enemy every night he went on the court. And, not only in other arenas where he had heard every epithet and threat, but also he was playing racism because he was trying to dispel every myth about black athletes, every stereotype. about black athletes every night he played and how he played, and his tenacity and his ability to stay on the court despite injury, to keep coming back out there. He stayed and stayed. And so understanding what was going on, the pressure he was feeling within the context of that, and of course he was impacted by all the Jim Crow South growing up. It impacted his, he never had gone to a school with a white person until he went to Auburn. He was valedictorian of Greene County Training School. Mm. And, so the environment he grew up in, and the movement, the civil rights movement, which was very active in Greene County. That was, John Lewis came there, SNCC, Dr. King came there. It was, he saw the movement of the people, and they did get a lot accomplished there.
Why do you think that Henry's story is not a well-known story?
Well, Henry, the interesting thing is, the interesting thing is that when Henry left, he was a hero. I mean, when he played his final game, he played the whole senior season with a very injured knee that had not been properly taken care of the year before, 2 torn ligaments. He played, essentially, as teammates say, on one leg that year. And so when he leaves the game, his final home game, he gets an ovation for 90 seconds. Now, think about that. 90 seconds in 1972, when he came there, there was letters to the president about him not coming there, but he changed a lot of people's minds about black athletes, about black people. Many people that went to Auburn games had never had a chance to cheer for a black person during this, in their life. So he brought black and white together to some degree simply by his God-given talent and his fortitude, his courage. So he was a hero when he leaves, and then 2 years later, he dies. He kills himself. And so now everything changes the way he's seen. I mean, people that knew him, Henry was a good guy, and nobody really can believe he killed himself. But, Auburn has certainly not wanted to talk about him, but it's not just Auburn. You look around the SEC, and there's two schools that have really moved to recognize their first black athletes. And it took, in one case at Vanderbilt, it took the student body to do that in the early 2000s, and at Kentucky, it took a fellow alumnus, a teammate, a lawyer that got them going for Kentucky to do that. We don't want to go and touch that time. And I talked to a black studies professor earlier this year, and she said, that's the first example of social distancing. The COVID was just starting. We don't want to touch that as a nation, because it reminds us of a dark time on where we've been. And I think that's so true. And in Henry's case, it's just magnified by the fact that it was a suicide, which there were other things going on in his life. He was working as a coach at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and he was a student assistant, and that had been terminated. And so he couldn't finish his degree. He had been unable to finish his degree at Auburn. He was taken off scholarship, even though he was continuing to work after he did not make it in the NBA, primarily because of the knee injury. So, there's a lot of sadness to that. It's a tough story, but I think it's a necessary story because it tells us so much about America at that time. And it tells us about a significant, as you've said earlier, a significant black life that sacrificed, a guy that sacrificed greatly. But this is, personal history is American history.
Well, I think one of the things I had a discussion with one of the senior administrators at Auburn a few years ago, and what I said to him was, "Our history is our history," and I think because throughout the years history has been told in a way where it wasn't maybe 100% factual. It was, it was nice racism that went on. And you have to face what it was. I mean, there was an incredible weight on Henry's shoulders. I remember when he would go across the tracks, and across the tracks was where, at that time, where Black people lived. And he took me one night, and I was like his little brother. And we went to Vans, which was a nightclub where people like my parents' age went. And so here I am in there, and it's like, why are we in here? But Henry was a hero in Vans. Everybody wanted to come up and talk to him. Everybody wanted to shake his hand. And it's hard to be a hero in this spot, this area, and then go back to where you should be the hero, and you're ignored, other than that 60 minutes or whatever it is, 40 minutes when you're on the basketball court. It's an incredible weight, and I watched him carry it, and I watched James Owens carry it, and I always say, in the end, I think it broke their spirits. It was just an incredible weight to have to carry. Where do you want to go with the story, Sam? Is there a movie somewhere out there?
I don't know. I'm certainly sending the book to a few folks that are tied to movies. A couple of people have approached me by documentaries, but that nothing has happened. Nothing has happened with that yet. So my goal is to spread the story as far as possible, and I think it's important for this generation coming along that this story is so instructive about the way things were. You're taking one person's life and you're learning so much about society. You learn a lot about courage, but you learn so much about our society. And Brian Stevenson says so well that there can be no reconciliation. We're in the midst where we clearly need some reconciliation in this country now, but there can be no reconciliation until there is truth telling,
right? And
about the way it was,
right.
And there's some understanding. If there was just some understanding of that, I think there would be we've got generations of people that really have no idea of what of this era we're talking about. And as you say, it was a sanitized version. And I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Certainly Jim Crow was alive and well there, but I didn't really understand the way things were in the small town South until later on, in the 70s and 80s. And Henry's story has been a tremendous education for me. So he has taught me a lot, and even for more than 40 years after his death.
I got one more thing, and then we're going to go to Barbara and Mike.
Okay.
And I remember the night that I found out Henry had died. I was in the athletic dorm, and I walked into the TV room, and there were 3-4 guys in there. And then the news came on from Columbus, I think, and the guy started talking about the Auburn athlete who had died, and then he threw Henry's name out, and it just threw me for a loop. And then I remember us trying to reconcile whether or not he committed suicide. And I think no one knew, because there was a part of Henry, like I think all of us, that you kept hid. You didn't let everybody in. You didn't let everybody know. Henry was always laughing and joking. He was the life. If we were in his room, he was the one talking, telling us stories, and so on and so forth. And so we didn't know that he had this battle going on within himself, in terms of what he felt like he disappointed himself and he disappointed people when he hadn't. And I think that's a part of it that people don't realize. Yeah, it was bad when the Ku Klux were out and that stuff, but it was equally as bad when you had to hide who you were. You couldn't be who you were when your spirit was taken away from you, so to speak. So let me get Michael and Barbara in here, and then we'll ask some questions and get them to. So Barbara, you're up first. What questions you got for Sam?
Sam, I just got to tell you, this is probably one of the best, but the most emotional book I've ever read in my life, and probably because it hits so close to home. I think I probably felt every emotion possible while reading the book, from pride to fear to anger, happy, sad. It covered everything. And I think Tom has already touched on it. I can't wait to see the movie. I just, I don't know what we can do to push this, but this needs to be made into a movie right away. And everybody I know, I'm going to help push your book, because I think everyone needs to read the book. It is just phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. It was an honor, as I said, to tell his story, because he was, as more I got into the story, I would say, he became sort of a hero.
Yes,
I don't know if that helped he hurt my objectivity. But those emotions you felt, I feel good that you felt them, because those are the emotions I felt, and my job was try to communicate that.
Yeah. Sam, Barbara, and let me put it in context too. I mean, Henry could have gone. What was it, Villanova that really
could have gone to Villanova in his junior year? He would have played in the national championship game against UCLA, and he would have been George Raveling, who was the guy recruiting him out of for Villanova, out of Bowling Green, Alabama. He says he would have been the other guard with Chris Ford, and of course that team had Howard Porter, and they came very close, the closest of anybody during that 7-year run UCLA won of beating UCLA, lost by 5 or so. So he would have been certainly gotten that exposure, yes, and got that thrill of playing for the national championship.
Michael,
and what a huge
I'm sorry.
he made.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I was just going to add. I was just adding, Henry made such a huge sacrifice coming to Auburn and giving up an opportunity to attend a school like Villanova. So, every Auburn graduate owes such a debt to Henry Harris, and university does as well. We've got to push to make sure that they recognize this man.
He does. We're ignoring, they've recognized Harold Franklin finally. They gave him his master's, which was great this year. And they've named the Student Center, which had just opened when Henry got there, for Harold Melton, Chief Justice, Georgia's Supreme Court Chief Justice Harold Melton. They've made big steps in going back and healing from the, healing forward, healing from the past. And, Henry is the obvious guy that has been left out of that. And suicide, as I say in the book, suicide seems to put you in the penalty box of history. And, it's interesting, that harm Meriwether Lewis's image for a long time. We've kind of gotten over that. And right now we understand suicide anymore, but Henry Lee is trapped back there in that time and that era when there was such a black mark, so to speak, against anybody that committed suicide. And unfortunately, particularly in the black community, because that's a cultural, historical thing with the black church, of course. But there's white churches that have created the same thing. But that kind of hurt him within the black community too. and the history of it. And he didn't stay the course. Well, he stayed. The sacrifice he made was not the decision. I mean, that was a sacrifice to go to Auburn, but the real sacrifice was staying. When there were times he wanted to leave, was just staying despite he saw how things really were. He was face to face with the way things were in America. And, he'd been somewhat protected from that living in Bowler, Alabama.
James Owens, of course, who was second. James was the first football player. James told me many, many times that the only reason he stayed was Henry. Henry gave him the courage to stay. I don't think you can imagine what it was like. I think in your book it's 160. I'm just throwing this now. 160 athletes in the athletic dorm.
Yeah.
He's the only black one. I came 2 years later, 3 years later, whatever it was. I could not have done that. I don't think I could have done that. I could have been the only one there by myself. And that was just an incredible thing. And I can see, with us, again, there was a lot of bravado or whatever, because he was the oldest. He was the leader. He was the one that told us, you can't leave. You have to stay here. This isn't just for us. This is for all those who's coming behind us. And so I for the longest, I never believed the suicide thing, but now that I've come to know him and I've seen and read some of the things in your book, read some of the disappointing things that happened, not just at Auburn, but after Auburn, that Auburn didn't have anything to do with. I could see whether he may have gone down that path. There just didn't seem to be, after Auburn, everywhere he landed, it didn't necessarily work out the way he thought it could. And it was a tough thing.
Michael, as James said, he was like a whipped puppy after he didn't make up the NBA. And so, that whole experience through he was looking through the rest of the world. He was, it was difficult.
Michael?
Sam, I want to commend you on your efforts and the accomplishment of completing such a difficult task. And I have two questions.
Thank you.
You're absolutely welcome. I have two questions, but the first one I'm going to ask you, tell me how difficult it was for you to really write this book. Because a lot of times when books are written about individuals, the person is still alive to tell their side of the story. You wrote this book after Henry, and doing your research and everything, how difficult was it for you to continue to go through and journey on as you found out all of these emotional and sad things?
Well, I was told by a really good writer early on that it would be hard to make a book out of his life because he's not around to give you insights into what he was thinking. So the job was to talk to his, interviewed at least 100 people to try to piece that together. And I read a lot of material, researched a lot of material. I had talked to other first black athletes at different schools, and I continued to try to understand that more. So as I find this, yes, there were certain points that came in the research that, wow, I didn't know that. Wow. Well, then I began to understand the whole picture a little better. And I think if anything, that drove me further. And it pushed me further. This story needed to be told. I think I saw those as mileposts that I guess this was a journey for me. But that was, yes, this story needs to be told. You're embarking on the right thing. It was sad, but I also felt like I had been given an opportunity. Writing is what I did. I had the interest. I'd been given an opportunity, and I needed to continue to push forward on it. And as I got, the mainstream presses didn't want it. suicide, maybe because it was Black History. This is in the early 2000s, and as recently as a couple of years ago. That just made me more determined to get it out there.
Well, thank you. My second question is, and by the way, I heard your speech the other year down at Auburn. I was in attendance, and you talked about the game of Henry Harris and what a phenomenal athlete he was. And I got an opportunity to see him play when he was at Auburn. As a matter of fact, he was dating one of my best friend's sisters, and he was saying, you got to go see Henry. As a matter of fact, they call him Henry the Hawk, if I'm not mistaken. And there are a couple things that I noticed is that Henry was probably only 6'2", maybe 6'3", and which would be the ideal size to play guard, or in particular in that day, a shooting guard. But when I went to see him play, they had him playing down low as a forward, maybe even a power forward, out of position, and he had a knee brace on. And so it seems like he was facing inequities within the game of basketball on his own team, because you talked about the time that Henry went out and he was scoring a lot of baskets, and then all of a sudden they took the ball out of his hand, and he had to pass it to somebody else to be the leading scorer because they didn't want Henry to be the leading scorer. Expound on that a little bit.
Well, I think that kind of snuck up on him. I mean, he'd had a great, but you're exactly right. Your perceptions are exactly right. He had a great freshman season. There was just you had to play on freshman team. The NCAA ruled it, and he gets in there as a sophomore, and like his second SEC game, he's at home and he's scoring, and he's got 20 points with 10 minutes left, and he comes out of the game and gets a big applause. People had liked him. The students really adopted him, although they might move away and slide their desk away when he came and sat down in a room. They liked him in a classroom. They liked him on the court, and so he scores those 20 points, comes out of the game. Well, John Mingill, the big scorer at that time, who was a year ahead of Henry and already a star, I think later in the season, stays in the game to score 60 points against Alabama. And so I think what I'm saying is slipped up on. Right, here's this black athlete, and he's going to go out there and score all these points. And how's that going to look? And I don't know if Bill Lynn, the coach, had pressure on him or not, but the ball did not go to him as much. He would have games where he scored 20 points, but him being a star or even dribbling the ball up, just at that time, the stereotypes, having a black guy running your offense, whoa, that would have been, no, black athletes weren't seen as being smart enough to do that, although UCLA consistently had black point guards. So now, so he becomes a forward. Why? Because he becomes a forward because he'll do the dirty work. He's the defensive player. He's the best defensive player on the team. But Bill Lynn would say he was the best defensive player in the SEC. And, he would be down underneath the basket guarding the power forward of the other team. And that was all. He always got the assignment of the best player on the other team. And usually it was because he could jump. He was playing power forwards. And what that, even Mingill admitted, what that hurt him is getting out of the fast break. And he couldn't get out from under the basket. And that was his game. Fast break, one-on-one moves, driving to the basket. And so that hurt his ability to score. And then he, as you mentioned, the knee brace, that's one of the things I remember seeing as in the final times I saw him play was wearing that brace. He got in a game against Alabama late in his junior year. He somebody fell on him. He said a big guy fell on him, and he sustained two torn ligaments, ACL and MCL. And he played the final 5 games of the season, and not just played a little bit. He started most of them. He started all of them and played most of the game in all of them. And why did he do that? There again was that stereotype. I mean, they were pumping him up with pain meds so he could play, and he knew he needed to play. That he had to prove that black people were tough enough, which is absurd as we think now. That's why it's hard to grasp this story, because we can't understand that. But the theory was blacks will they'll quit on you when the going gets tough. They won't play hurt for you. Well, he did all that for Auburn. And because he came and stayed, what would it look like if we left? That's what James Owens used to say. And that's what Henry, what would it look like? It would have been, it would have set integration back. And so he stayed. And so years later, they have Charles Barkley, Bo Jackson, Frank Thomas, Cam Newton. And a tremendously courageous young man.
It was in incremental steps, because as you say, later it was Bo, and I remember the night Bo won the Heisman, man, I cried like a baby, because it was just so important. And 10 years before that, you couldn't get the ball. I mean, you were going to get the ball in limited amounts of time, but you weren't going to be the star. Now you could do the dirty work, and Henry did the dirty work. And as a matter of fact, I remember we used to kid him because John Mingelt was a star, and it was during the time when Sullivan and Beasley were there on the football team, and then it was Sullivan to Beasley and Harris to Mingelt. That's what we used to say. As ugly as that is now, and I remember when he would. I think I pretty much remember when his spirit, when he just was going to make it through. If I can make it through, I can get a shot at the NBA, and hopefully I can play in the NBA. I've pretty much done everything I can do here. I've done everything I can. So, Barbara, you got anything else? Michael?
Again, just thank you. And thank you, Thom, for being a pioneer at Auburn as well. Your contributions mean a lot to all of us who come through Auburn behind you, and people like Henry Harris and James Owens. You guys are definitely heroes in my eyes. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sam, for telling the story.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And
Sam, I want to make sure people know what this Henry Harris. Remember Henry Harris, the lost icon of a revolution. And I love, because in our time, revolution was a big word, and it was a revolution in a lot of ways. A story of hope and self-sacrifice in America. One of my good friends, and I'm so happy that you did this, Sam. It's worth it. And sometimes, maybe you don't get the accolades, but to a lot of people, Henry Harris was a very, very important man.
He was, no question, he was an important man, and we'll continue to work to get that story out and him remembered, because there's a lot we can learn from it and a lot we can heal from within that. I appreciate your help all along, and I appreciate y'all having me on there for us to be able to talk about it. It's a good day if we can talk about Henry Harris. Remember.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yes, it is. All right. Well, Sam, we appreciate it. Michael, Barbara, thank you. We're going to wrap this up, and I'm going to always end with a quote, and my quote today is from Henry. And I remember sitting in his room and I said, Henry, why did you do this if it makes you so unhappy? And he said, I did it for the old folks. And that sort of became our mantra. That sort of became our thing, that we were doing this for other people. We were doing this for the Bo Jacksons and the Charles Barkleys and Barbara Wallace Edwards and Michael Walker and all those who came after us. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Barbara. I want to thank the audience. We appreciate you. Thank the communicator, Emily. Thanks our sponsor, Best Girl. If you're interested in having your business be a sponsor of the show, get in touch with us at Tom@BestGirl. Thank Emily Hedrick. And next week's guest is Eric Jones. Eric is a theater and film producer who is working on a biopic of Alabama native Nat King Cole. That's a wrap for our show today. Enjoy yourself and make every day count, and peace.